In the time before time, when the multiverse hung suspended between possibility and form, there existed a silence so profound that even the gods who would one day claim dominion over creation had not yet drawn breath. The planes themselves were unformed, their boundaries undefined, their laws unwritten. In that primordial darkness, something stirred. It was neither god nor mortal, neither elemental nor aberration, but something older still, a consciousness vast and terrible, singular and absolute, coiled within the fabric of potential reality itself. The ancient texts would later name this being Io, the ninefold dragon, the concordant dragon, the first and greatest of all worms. In that moment of cosmic genesis, when the first sparks of divine consciousness began to flicker across the void, Io opened eyes that had never known sleep and began the work that would define all draconic existence across every world, every plane, every reality that would follow. The nature of Io's origin remained among the greatest mysteries preserved in the oldest divine chronicles. Some sages claimed the ninefold dragon emerged spontaneously from the confluence of opposing cosmic forces. A perfect balance of creation and destruction, order and chaos, made manifest in draconic form. Others insisted Io predated even the primordials, existing as a fundamental aspect of the multiverse's architecture, as essential to reality as time or space or magic itself. The truth, as with all things touching the dawn ages, lay buried beneath epochs of divine conflict and cosmic transformation. What could be known with certainty was that Io possessed power beyond mortal comprehension, beyond even the understanding of most deities. The ninefold dragon's essence contained multitudes, embodying every aspect of draconic nature simultaneously. Within Io existed the rage of red wyrms and the patience of gold, the cunning of green dragons and the nobility of silver, the ambition of blue and the whimsy of brass. All colors, all temperaments, all possibilities of dragonkind dwelled unified within the concordant dragon's cosmic form. Io did not create dragons through deliberate artifice or divine proclamation, as gods might shape mortal races to serve their purposes. Instead, the first dragons emerged as natural extensions of Io's own existence, fragments of the ninefold dragon's infinite essence taking independent form. These proto-dragons possessed none of the sophistication that would later define true dragonkind, but they carried within them the fundamental spark that separated dragons from all other creatures. They were beings of pure elemental force, incarnations of primal power that required no worship, answered to no higher authority, and existed as expressions of absolute sovereignty. The earliest dragons knew neither speech nor civilization, yet even in their primitive state, they demonstrated the core traits that would define their species across all ages to come. They were territorial, powerful, cunning, and utterly convinced of their own supremacy over all other forms of life. The relationship between Io and these first proto-dragons evolved across ages that predated mortal record. The ninefold dragon did not rule them as a monarch commands subjects, nor guide them as a shepherd tends flocks. Instead, Io existed as the ultimate expression of draconic potential, a living embodiment of what all dragons might become if they achieved absolute perfection. The proto-dragons recognized in Io something greater than themselves, not through worship or submission, but through an acknowledgement of pure superiority. This recognition became the foundation of draconic psychology across all subsequent ages. Dragons would never bow to gods as mortals did, never surrender their essential autonomy, but they could recognize and respect power that eclipsed their own. That respect, grudging and conditional, formed the only hierarchy dragons would ever truly accept. The multiverse began to take more definite shape as other cosmic forces emerged from the primordial chaos. The primordials rose from the elemental planes, vast beings of destruction and creation who shaped worlds according to their incomprehensible desires. The first gods coalesced from the raw stuff of belief and divine spark, claiming domains and portfolios, establishing the frameworks that would govern mortal existence. These beings regarded Io with wariness and respect, for the ninefold dragon predated their rise and answered to none of their cosmic hierarchies. Io maintained a calculated distance from the wars that erupted between gods and primordials, that apocalyptic struggle later known as the Dawn War. The concordant dragon had no interest in dominion over the multiverse, no desire to claim worshippers or establish divine realms. Io's purpose centered entirely on the perfection and perpetuation of dragonkind, a goal that required neither allies nor subjects. During the epoch when gods and primordials tore reality apart in their cosmic struggle, Io began the great work that would transform dragons from simple expressions of elemental force into a race capable of matching or exceeding the gods themselves. The ninefold dragon gathered the most powerful of the proto-dragons, those who had survived the cataclysms that accompanied the Dawn War and proven themselves worthy of elevation. Through methods never recorded in any text accessible to mortal scholars, Io shaped these beings into the first true dragons. These were not the mindless beasts that had preceded them, but creatures of terrible intelligence and cosmic awareness. They understood the nature of the planes, comprehended the flows of magic that would later be known as the Weave, and possessed the capacity for speech, reason, and the accumulation of knowledge that would define draconic culture for all time to come. The first true dragons emerged into a multiverse being fundamentally reshaped by the Dawn War's ongoing devastation. They witnessed gods hurling entire planes at primordials, saw elemental forces capable of unmaking reality clash against divine power that could rewrite the laws of existence itself. These worms learned quickly that power alone meant nothing without the wisdom to wield it properly and the patience to choose one's battles with care. They observed how both gods and primordials destroyed themselves through reckless expenditure of cosmic force, how pride and rage led even the mightiest beings to their own annihilation. These lessons became encoded into draconic nature itself, creating the paradoxical psychology that would define their race. Dragons were beings of immense power, who understood that power meant nothing without restraint, creatures of legendary pride who recognized that pride unchecked led only to destruction. From this crucible of cosmic war, two figures emerged who would shape draconic destiny as profoundly as Io itself. The circumstances of their creation or birth varied depending on which ancient text one consulted, but all agreed on their fundamental nature and significance. Bahamut, the platinum dragon, embodied the noblest aspects of draconic existence. Justice, honor, protection, and wisdom found perfect expression in his gleaming form. Tiamat, the chromatic dragon, manifested the darker but no less essential draconic traits. Greed, conquest, domination, and ruthless survival instinct made her 5 heads the most terrifying sight in all creation. The relationship between these two beings and Io remained among the great mysteries that scholars debated across millennia. Some texts claimed they were Io's offspring, born through methods only a being of the ninefold dragon's cosmic nature could employ. Others insisted they represented opposing aspects of Io's own nature, given independent existence, fragments of the concordant dragon's essence that had achieved permanent separation. A third interpretation suggested they existed as parallel beings to Io, cosmic expressions of draconic nature that arose simultaneously with the ninefold dragon but represented specific poles of the draconic spectrum rather than its unified totality. Bahamut and Tiamat both possessed power that approached Io's own, yet they lacked the concordant dragon's essential unity. Where Io contained all draconic possibilities in perfect balance, Bahamut and Tiamat each embodied extreme expressions of opposing philosophies. This fundamental difference created tension that would eventually shatter draconic civilization and reshape the entire species. For ages beyond mortal counting, however, the 3 greatest worms maintained an uneasy coexistence. Io pursued the perfection of dragonkind with single-minded focus, caring nothing for the petty conflicts of gods and mortals. Bahamut gathered those dragons who valued order, justice, and the protection of weaker beings, forming the core of what would become the metallic dragons. Tiamat claimed those worms who embraced conquest, domination, and the absolute right of the strong to rule the weak, establishing what would become the chromatic dragons. Neither Bahamut nor Tiamat openly challenged Io's supremacy, but the growing divergence between their philosophies created fault lines that ran through the entire draconic race. The first Dragon Empire emerged on a world whose name was lost to time, erased by cataclysms that unmade entire planes of existence. On this world, dragons achieved a civilization that exceeded anything gods or mortals would create for uncounted ages to come. Cities of crystalline spires stretched across entire continents, shaped not through crude construction but through the direct manipulation of reality itself. Dragons had learned to harness the raw magical energy that permeated the multiverse, bending it to their will with a sophistication that made later mortal spellcasting look like a child's fumbling attempts. They created wonders that existed at the intersection of magic, art, and cosmic engineering. Floating citadels drifted through the sky, sustained by forces that required no ongoing maintenance, no external power source, simply existing because the dragons who created them had decreed it should be so. Libraries contained not books but direct recordings of draconic consciousness itself, allowing any Wyrm to experience the accumulated memories and knowledge of their ancestors without translation or interpretation. The social structure of the First Empire reflected draconic nature in its purest form. There were no kings or councils, no formal hierarchies or bureaucratic systems. Instead, dragons organized themselves according to a principle called the Doctrine of Supremacy. Each dragon claimed territory based on their power to hold it, established their status through direct challenge and competition, and maintained their position through constant demonstration of superiority. This system prevented stagnation while ensuring only the most capable Wyrms held positions of influence. Young dragons learned from ancient Wyrms not through formal instruction but through observation and challenge. When a young dragon believed itself ready, it would challenge an established Wyrm for territory, position, or resources. These challenges rarely resulted in death, for dragons recognized that killing their own kind weakened the entire race. Instead, the defeated Wyrm yielded, accepted a reduction in status, and plotted how to reclaim what they had lost. This constant churn of challenge and response kept the entire empire dynamic, aggressive, and perpetually evolving. Magic permeated every aspect of draconic civilization in ways that would seem impossible to later mortal societies. Dragons did not cast spells as mortals would eventually learn to do, through careful memorization and precise execution of verbal and somatic components. Instead, Wyrms manipulated magical energy directly, shaping reality through pure will reinforced by their innate connection to the fundamental forces of creation. A dragon might transform the weather across entire regions simply by deciding it should be so, or alter the terrain of their territory to better suit their preferences without any ritual or preparation. This casual, effortless mastery of magic defined the power differential between dragons and every other form of intelligent life. Where gods required worship to maintain their power and mortals needed years of study to master even simple spells, dragons were born with abilities that exceeded anything other beings might achieve through millennia of effort. The First Empire expanded across multiple continents, establishing outposts on other worlds, even extending influence into the outer planes themselves. Dragons claimed entire regions of the elemental planes as territory, establishing citadels where fire met air, where earth bordered water, where the purest expressions of elemental force could be studied and exploited. They created planar gates that allowed instantaneous travel between distant worlds, forged artifacts whose power rivaled the weapons gods carried into battle, and pushed the boundaries of what magic itself could accomplish. During this golden age, dragons believed themselves invincible, the rightful inheritors of a multiverse that existed primarily to showcase their magnificence. No other race could challenge them. No force in creation could threaten their dominion. The gods themselves seemed content to allow dragons their empire, unwilling to provoke a conflict with beings who possessed both individual power, approaching divine levels, and the collective strength of an entire civilization. This age of absolute dominion could not last. The first cracks appeared not from external threat, but from the growing divide between Bahamut's followers and those who pledged loyalty to Tiamat. The philosophical differences that had always existed between metallic and chromatic dragons began to translate into open conflict. Metallic dragons believed their civilization should pursue wisdom, justice, and the responsible exercise of power. They argued that dragons, as the most powerful and intelligent beings in creation, bore responsibility for maintaining cosmic order and protecting weaker races from destruction. This position struck chromatic dragons as absurd weakness, a betrayal of the fundamental principle that power existed to be exercised, not constrained by ridiculous notions of responsibility or mercy. Chromatic dragons insisted that other races existed to serve draconic interests or be destroyed, that the strong owed nothing to the weak except perhaps a quick death. These were not abstract philosophical debates conducted in academic settings. They manifested as territorial disputes, resource conflicts, and eventually open warfare between factions that had once been merely rivals. The war of chromatic supremacy erupted across multiple worlds simultaneously, shattering the first empire into fragments that would never be reunited. Chromatic dragons, led by ancient red and blue Wyams who spoke with Tiamat's authority, launched coordinated attacks against metallic strongholds across a dozen planes. They argued that metallic dragons had grown soft, weak, corrupted by their foolish compassion for lesser beings. The empire needed purification, a return to the fundamental truth that dragons existed to dominate, not to protect. Metallic dragons responded with fury born of betrayal, for many had considered their chromatic cousins to be allies despite philosophical differences. Gold and silver Wyams, who had maintained scholarly exchanges with blue dragons, found themselves fighting for survival against former colleagues. Bronze dragons who had shared territory peacefully with green worms discovered that supposed peace had been merely preparation for betrayal. The war consumed entire continents, transformed prosperous worlds into lifeless wastelands, and demonstrated that when dragons turned their full power against each other, nothing in creation could stand between them and mutual annihilation. The conflict escalated beyond anything either side had anticipated. Both factions called upon ancient magic that had been theoretical, experimental, too dangerous to use except in the most desperate circumstances. Chromatic dragons unleashed spells that unraveled the fundamental structure of reality itself, creating zones where physical laws became optional suggestions and chaos reigned absolute. Metallic dragons responded with their own devastating innovations, developing magic that could strip a dragon of its innate abilities, reduce ancient Wyams to helpless hatchlings, or bind them into eternal imprisonment within pocket dimensions specifically designed to hold draconic power. Cities that had stood for millennia vanished in single cataclysmic exchanges. Entire populations of lesser races died as collateral damage, their civilizations reduced to archaeological curiosities because they had the misfortune to exist near a battlefield. The outer planes themselves felt the impact as dragon souls streamed into the afterlife in numbers that overwhelmed the normal mechanisms of divine judgment and cosmic recycling. The gods watched this apocalyptic conflict with growing alarm. Dragons dying in such numbers weakened the fundamental balance of the multiverse, for worms were not simple mortals whose souls followed predictable patterns. Each dragon represented a fragment of Io's cosmic essence, a piece of the fundamental nature of power itself. When dragons died permanently, that essence risked being lost entirely, creating holes in reality that nothing else could fill. More pragmatically, the devastation dragons were inflicting on the material plane threatened to destroy worlds that gods had claimed as their domains, unraveling centuries of divine work and killing mortal populations whose worship sustained divine power. Several deities proposed direct intervention, sending avatars or divine servants to force the warring dragons into peace. Cooler heads prevailed, recognizing that dragons would unite instantly against any external threat, transforming a civil war into a cosmic conflict that could destroy the gods themselves. Instead, the deities turned to the one being whose authority dragons might actually respect. Io had remained distant from the conflict, refusing to choose between Bahamut's vision and Tiamat's philosophy. The concordant dragon embodied both perspectives simultaneously, understood the necessity of both protection and domination, both compassion and ruthlessness. To choose one over the other would betray Io's fundamental nature, would suggest that one aspect of draconic existence was superior to another. This neutrality enraged both factions, who believed Io's involvement could end the war immediately. Metallic dragons argued that Io should support justice and order, should use cosmic authority to force chromatic dragons into accepting reasonable limits on their behavior. Chromatic dragons insisted Io should crush the weak-willed metallics who had betrayed their nature, who had forgotten that dragons bowed to no authority except superior power. The ninefold dragon heard these arguments and rejected both, maintaining silence that many interpreted as indifference, but which actually represented the only position Io could hold without destroying the essential unity that made the concordant dragon what it was. The gods chose a different approach, one that would reshape draconic destiny in ways none of them fully anticipated. A coalition of deities, whose portfolios involved warfare, strategy, and cosmic balance, approached Io with a proposition. They would not ask the concordant dragon to choose sides or intervene directly in the draconic civil war. Instead, they would create circumstances that forced dragons themselves to recognize the futility of their conflict, to understand that mutual destruction served no one's interests. The gods proposed creating a race that could challenge dragons, not in individual power but in collective strength and adaptability. This race would not be strong enough to defeat dragonkind, but would be capable enough to ensure that any dragon faction that emerged victorious from civil war would find itself immediately engaged in a new conflict against a worthy opponent. The brilliance of this strategy lay in its indirection. Dragons would not unite against a divine threat, but they might reconsider fratricidal warfare if it left them vulnerable to mortal competitors. Io considered this proposal with the timeless patience that only beings who measured existence in cosmic epochs could muster. The concordant dragon recognized the manipulation inherent in the gods' plan, understood they were attempting to use draconic pride and paranoia to achieve what direct intervention could not. Yet Io also recognized truth in their argument. Dragons were destroying themselves, squandering power and potential in a conflict that served no purpose except satisfying wounded pride and philosophical obstinacy. The Dragon Empire would not survive if this war continued. The civilization dragons had built across millennia was already fragmenting beyond recognition, and each passing year made reunification less likely. Moreover, Io had always believed that dragons needed challenge to achieve their full potential. Unchallenged supremacy bred complacency, stagnation, weakness disguised as strength. If the gods created a race capable of threatening dragons, it would force Wyrms to evolve, adapt, and maintain the competitive edge that made them superior to all other beings. The concordant dragon agreed to the gods' proposal with certain conditions. The new race would be formidable but not overwhelming, capable but not unstoppable. They would possess the potential to match dragons in specific areas while remaining fundamentally inferior in others. Most importantly, they would be given no inherent advantages against dragonkind beyond their own creativity and determination. The gods agreed to these terms and began their work. They created giants, beings of tremendous size and strength, who could challenge even adult dragons in physical combat. Giants lacked dragons' magical sophistication, possessed none of the innate connection to fundamental cosmic forces that made Wyrms so powerful, but they were cunning, adaptable, and most crucially, they bred quickly compared to dragons. Where a dragon might produce a handful of offspring across centuries, giants could field armies that replaced losses within decades. This demographic advantage would prove decisive in the conflicts to come. The introduction of giants onto the material plane transformed draconic civilization almost immediately. The civil war between metallic and chromatic dragons did not end, but it diminished as both factions recognized a new priority: These giants were claiming territory that dragons had held since the first empire's founding, building fortresses in regions that had always been undisputed draconic domain. Worse, giants were developing sophisticated societies complete with architecture, technology, and even magic that showed disturbing sophistication. They were not simple beasts or primitive cultures that dragons could casually dominate or ignore. Giants represented genuine civilizational rivals, beings capable of challenging draconic supremacy through collective organization and technological innovation. The more pragmatic dragons immediately recognized the threat this posed. If giants continued expanding unchecked, they could drive dragons into increasingly marginal territories, could claim the richest resources, could establish themselves as the dominant civilization across the material plane. The Dragon-Giant Wars began as a series of localized skirmishes, individual dragons responding to what they perceived as territorial encroachment by upstart beings who did not know their place. These early conflicts revealed uncomfortable truths about the changing reality of power dynamics in the post-Empire world. Individual dragons could defeat small groups of giants handily enough, but giants learned quickly. They developed tactics specifically designed to counter draconic advantages, weapons capable of piercing dragon scales, fortifications that could withstand even adult worm breath attacks. More importantly, giants demonstrated a unity of purpose that dragons, fractured by civil war and individualistic by nature, could not match. When one giant clan suffered dragon attacks, neighboring clans sent reinforcements, resources, tactical advice. Giants were building alliances, creating mutual defense pacts, establishing supply networks that let them sustain military campaigns across entire continents. Dragons responded to this threat with characteristic arrogance and individualism. Ancient worms insisted that giants were merely a temporary inconvenience, beings who would inevitably recognize draconic supremacy once a few examples had been made. These worms launched solo attacks against giant fortifications, confident their individual power would suffice. Many succeeded initially, destroying strongholds and slaughtering giant populations, but giants rebuilt, adapted, and returned stronger. They developed giant killer weapons, ballista capable of punching through dragon scales, tactics that herded individual worms into kill zones where dozens of giants could attack simultaneously. Dragons began dying in numbers that shocked Wyram civilization to its core. Not ancient Wyrams, not yet, for beings that powerful remained effectively invincible. But young and adult dragons found themselves genuinely threatened by organized giant forces, discovered that power and magic meant nothing if giants could force combat on their terms. The crystallizing moment came at the Battle of Thousand Spears Valley, a conflict that demonstrated both giants' tactical sophistication and dragons' desperate need for coordination. A coalition of 5 giant clans, representing frost giants, fire giants, and stone giants, lured a flight of adult blue and green dragons into a canyon where they had prepared extensive fortifications and ambush positions. The dragons, confident in their superiority, pursued what they believed was a fleeing giant force. When they entered the canyon, they discovered hundreds of giants waiting with weapons specifically designed to exploit draconic weaknesses. The battle lasted 3 days, resulted in the death of 7 adult dragons, and marked the first time in recorded history that giants had achieved a decisive victory against multiple worms working in coordination. News of this defeat spread through draconic civilization like wildfire, forcing even the most arrogant ancient Wyams to reconsider their assumptions about giant capabilities. The war escalated into a multi-generational conflict that transformed both civilizations in fundamental ways. Dragons were forced to develop strategies that contradicted their essential nature, had to learn cooperation and coordination that felt unnatural to beings who defined themselves through individual supremacy. Flight tactics evolved as Wyams learned to support each other in combat rather than fighting as lone predators. Intelligence networks emerged as dragons recognized the value of information about giant movements, fortifications, and technological developments. Some Wyams even began studying giant society, learning their languages, infiltrating their cities in disguise, gathering the kind of detailed enemy understanding that had never been necessary when dealing with lesser beings. These adaptations strengthened draconic civilization in certain ways, forced evolution that might have otherwise taken millennia. But they also represented a profound shift in draconic self-perception. Dragons were no longer the unchallenged masters of creation. They were participants in a genuine struggle where victory required more than raw power. Giants evolved even more dramatically under the pressure of constant draconic assault. Their initial societies had been relatively primitive, based primarily on strength hierarchies and clan loyalty. The need to survive dragon attacks forced rapid advancement in architecture, engineering, metallurgy, and strategic thinking. Giants developed fortifications that could withstand dragon breath attacks, created underground cities that provided protection from aerial assault, and established supply networks that ensured isolated outposts could hold out during extended sieges. Giant magic, previously limited to shamanistic traditions and elemental manipulation, expanded dramatically as giant spellcasters studied captured draconic texts and developed their own traditions specifically designed to counter YRM advantages. The war created a giant civilization far more sophisticated than anything the gods who created them had anticipated, demonstrated that pressure and necessity could drive evolution faster than any amount of time allowed for peaceful development. The conflict reached its peak during what later chronicles called the Century of Fire and Stone, a 100-year period when both sides committed everything to achieving final victory. Dragons deployed magic on scales not seen since the Civil War, transforming entire regions into desolate wastelands to deny giants resources or habitability. They summoned allies from across the plains, recruiting devils, demons, elementals, and aberrations into service through promises of plunder or magical compulsion. Ancient Wyrms, who had remained aloof from the conflict for decades, finally engaged, recognizing that giant victory would mean permanent draconic decline. These ancient dragons brought power that reshaped battlefields, spells that could level mountains, breath weapons capable of incinerating armies. Giants responded by forging alliances with gods who opposed draconic domination, gained access to divine magic that let them heal wounds, resurrect fallen warriors, and receive prophetic guidance. They developed Titingent-killing weapons, artifacts capable of permanently slaying even ancient dragons, magical ballistae that could pierce scales no conventional weapon could scratch. Neither side could achieve decisive victory. Dragons possessed individual power that giants could never match, magic that let them strike anywhere with minimal warning, flight that provided tactical advantages no amount of giant ingenuity could fully counter. But giants had numbers, resilience, and collective organization that dragons could not overcome through power alone. For every giant fortress dragons destroyed, 3 more were constructed. For every giant army worms annihilated, reinforcements arrived within months. Giants were demonstrating something dragons had never truly understood before this conflict. Civilizational power did not derive solely from individual strength. Collective organization, technological innovation, and coordinated strategy could match or exceed even the mightiest individual capabilities. This revelation disturbed dragons on profound philosophical levels, challenged assumptions that had defined their self-perception since the First Empire's founding. The war ended not through decisive victory but through mutual exhaustion and the intervention of cosmic forces neither side could ignore. The prolonged conflict had damaged the material plane in ways that threatened permanent instability. Regions where dragons and giants had exchanged their most devastating attacks had become dead zones where reality itself functioned incorrectly, where gravity reversed randomly, where time flowed at inconsistent rates, where fundamental physical laws became unreliable. The gods recognized these zones represented tears in the fabric of creation, places where the barriers between planes had worn dangerously thin. Left unchecked, these damage zones could expand, merge, potentially unravel the entire material plane. The deities issued an ultimatum to both dragons and giants: end the war immediately, or face divine intervention that would involve the complete destruction of both civilizations. This was not bluff or negotiation. The gods demonstrated their seriousness by obliterating a particularly damaged region entirely, removing it from existence and leaving nothing but void in its place. Dragons and giants reluctantly negotiated what became known as the Compact of Division. Neither side surrendered or admitted defeat. Instead, they agreed to partition the material plane into distinct territories with neutral zones between them. Dragons would claim mountainous regions, islands, remote locations that suited their preference for isolation and inaccessibility. Giants would control the lowlands, forests, regions suitable for large-scale habitation and resource extraction. Both sides agreed to recognize these borders, to cease active warfare, and to establish formal protocols for resolving disputes without resorting to immediate violence. The compact included provisions for trade, cultural exchange, even occasional cooperation against mutual threats. It was not peace, exactly, but rather managed hostility, acknowledgement that continued total war served neither side's interests. Ancient Wayams signed the compact with visible reluctance, considering it a humiliation even as they recognized its necessity. Giant lords treated the compact as validation that their civilization now stood equal to dragonkind, a perspective that dragons found infuriating but could not effectively dispute. The post-war era saw dragons retreat into increased isolation, withdrawing from the extensive territorial holdings they had claimed during the empire's height. Many Wayams simply disappeared into remote lairs, establishing territories in places so inaccessible that giants could never threaten them. These dragons began the traditions that would later define common perceptions of their race. They gathered hordes, accumulating wealth not merely as resources but as tangible proof of their power and status. They established complex lair defenses, transforming natural caves into fortifications filled with traps, guardians, and magical wards. They studied magic with renewed intensity, determined to maintain superiority in the one area where giants could never truly compete. This period marked the transformation of dragons from civilization builders to solitary tyrants, from empire maintainers to individual powers who cared nothing for collective draconic interests. Not all dragons accepted this retreat into isolation. A faction called the Remembrance argued that dragons needed to maintain their civilization, that abandoning collective organization meant accepting permanent decline. These worms, primarily metallic dragons influenced by Bahamut's philosophy, attempted to preserve what they could of the First Empire's achievements. They maintained libraries, continued magical research, and established councils where dragons could coordinate responses to threats. The Remembrance never achieved the influence or scope of the original empire, but they ensured that draconic knowledge survived the post-war fragmentation. Their efforts would prove crucial during later eras when dragons needed access to ancient lore that would have otherwise been lost. Chromatic dragons largely ignored or actively opposed the Remembrance, viewing it as pathetic clinging to a dead past rather than acceptance of the truth that individual power mattered more than collective organization. The division between Bahamut's followers and Tiamat's servants became formalized during this period in ways that transcended simple philosophical disagreement. Metallic dragons increasingly viewed themselves as fundamentally different from chromatics, not merely worms with different priorities, but beings pursuing entirely distinct destinies. They embraced the concept that power carried responsibility, that their abilities obligated them to act as guardians and protectors rather than predators and tyrants. This shift represented rejection of core aspects of traditional draconic nature, suggested that some dragons believed their race needed to evolve beyond the principles that had always defined them. Chromatic dragons saw this as ultimate betrayal, proof that metallics had become corrupted beyond redemption. Tiamat's followers doubled down on traditional draconic values, insisted that strength existed to be exercised, that mercy was weakness, and that any dragon who rejected these truths had forfeited their right to call themselves worms. This ideological schism was reflected in the gods who represented each faction. Bahamut achieved full divine status during this period, ascending to join the established pantheons as a deity of justice, protection, and honorable warfare. Metallic dragons provided him with worship in forms that honored draconic dignity, acknowledging his superiority while maintaining their own autonomy. Bahamut established a realm called the Seven Heavens, where metallic dragons who died righteously would spend eternity in peace and contemplation. The Platinum Dragon recruited mortal followers as well, paladins and clerics who dedicated themselves to his principles. Tiamat took a different path, refusing to acknowledge any being as superior except through direct challenge. She claimed a realm in the Nine Hells, carved out territory through alliances and threats, and established herself as a power the archdevils themselves had to respect. Chromatic dragons followed Tiamat not through worship but through recognition of her supremacy, an acknowledgement that she represented the ultimate expression of chromatic draconic nature. The divergence between metallic and chromatic dragons accelerated as centuries passed. They developed distinct cultural traditions, different approaches to magic, separate understandings of what it meant to be a dragon. Metallic dragons established formal codes of conduct, created systems of mentorship where ancient worms guided younger dragons, and built networks of cooperation that allowed them to coordinate responses to threats. Chromatic dragons rejected all such structure, maintained the traditional approach where each worm stood alone, advanced through personal power, and owed loyalty to no one except when immediate circumstances demanded temporary alliance. These different approaches produced distinct civilizational outcomes. Metallic dragons maintained stable territories, established reputations that sometimes earned mortal respect or even cooperation, and achieved long-term goals through planning and patience. Chromatic dragons lived more chaotically, engaged in constant territorial disputes, and pursued short-term advantages over long-term stability. Neither approach was objectively superior. Both produced powerful individual YRMs, but they represented increasingly incompatible visions of draconic existence. Meanwhile, the giants who had fought dragons to a standstill began their own period of civilizational development unhindered by constant warfare. They constructed kingdoms that spanned continents, established trade networks between different giant species, and developed culture that rivaled anything dragons had achieved during their empire. Giant architecture became legendary, cyclopean structures that dwarfed even draconic citadels, fortresses, and palaces that demonstrated absolute mastery of stone and metal. Giant magic evolved distinct traditions based on different giant species' natural affinities. Storm giants developed deep understanding of weather and elemental forces. Fire giants mastered volcanic energies and metallurgical magic. Frost giants commanded ice and winter with casual expertise. These civilizations represented proof that giants had successfully challenged draconic supremacy, established themselves as peers rather than inferiors. The rise of giant civilization forced dragons to reconsider fundamental assumptions about their place in the multiverse. For the first time since Io's emergence in the Dawn Ages, dragons were not the supreme beings they had always believed themselves to be. Giants matched them in specific areas, exceeded them in others, and had demonstrated that collective organization could overcome individual superiority. This revelation created profound psychological impact across draconic culture. Some worms became obsessed with proving their superiority, launched provocative raids against giant settlements, and sought conflicts where they could demonstrate that raw power still mattered most. Others retreated even further into isolation, convinced that engaging with giants or any other beings only invited further humiliation. A third group, primarily metallic dragons influenced by Bahamut, attempted to establish actual diplomatic relationships with giant kingdoms, recognized that cooperation might serve draconic interests better than endless competition. During this period of relative peace between dragons and giants, a third force entered the material plane's political landscape. Mortal races, the species gods had created to populate their worlds and provide worship, began developing civilizations of their own. Humans, elves, dwarves, and dozens of other peoples established kingdoms, built cities, and started claiming territories neither dragons nor giants had bothered to contest. Initially, neither dragons nor giants considered mortals worthy of serious attention. These beings were small, weak, short-lived, and apparently incapable of achieving anything that would threaten established powers. Ancient dragons barely noticed mortal civilizations, treated them as environmental features rather than meaningful entities. Giants were slightly more engaged with mortals, sometimes using human or elf communities as labor forces or food sources, but still considered them fundamentally beneath notice. This dismissive attitude would prove catastrophic for both dragons and giants. Mortals possessed advantages neither of the older races initially recognized. They bred rapidly, replacing population losses within single generations rather than centuries. They adapted quickly, developing new technologies and strategies at a pace that left longer-lived races struggling to keep up. Most crucially, mortals could learn magic in ways that were accessible to individuals without innate abilities. A human wizard required decades of intense study to achieve what a young dragon knew instinctively, but that human could teach their techniques to others, could build magical traditions and schools that accumulated knowledge across generations. Within a few centuries, mortal spellcasters were achieving things that rivaled draconic magic, manipulating reality with sophistication that came from deliberate study rather than instinctive power. The elves proved particularly formidable in this regard. These mortals possessed lifespans that, while finite, stretched across centuries, giving individual elves time to develop expertise that approached draconic levels. Elven civilizations built cities that rivaled the First Empire's achievements, established magical traditions based on careful research and philosophical sophistication, and demonstrated that being inherently weaker did not mean being inherently inferior. Elf mages developed spells specifically designed to counter dragon advantages, enchantments that could penetrate ancient wards, illusions that fooled even Wyam senses, and most disturbingly, magic that could temporarily grant mortals dragon-like abilities, including flight, enhanced strength, and breath weapons. Dragons who encountered these elven spellcasters discovered they no longer possessed absolute magical superiority, had to take mortal magic seriously as genuine threat rather than curious novelty. Human civilizations took different paths but proved equally dangerous in their own ways. Humans lacked the elves' grace and longevity, but they possessed relentless ambition and adaptability that let them thrive in environments where other mortals failed. Human kingdoms expanded with aggressive speed, claiming territories and resources through sheer demographic momentum. Human warriors developed specifically anti-dragon tactics, studied Wyram behavior, created specialized weapons and armor designed to counter draconic advantages. Perhaps most significantly, humans proved willing to take risks that more cautious beings avoided. Human adventurers would assault dragon lairs seeking treasure and glory, would challenge Wyams despite overwhelming power disparities, would persist through failures that should have discouraged them. Dragons found themselves dealing with beings who simply would not accept draconic supremacy as natural law, who believed that with enough preparation, cunning, and luck, even ancient worms could be defeated. Dwarves represented yet another challenge to draconic dominance. Though of an indirect nature, dwarven civilizations established themselves primarily underground, building fortress cities within mountains that dragons had claimed as traditional territory. This created immediate territorial conflicts, but dwarves proved impossible to dislodge through simple force. Their fortifications were nearly impregnable, designed with defensive paranoia that anticipated every possible assault, including dragon attacks. Dwarven metalwork produced armor and weapons that could withstand dragon breath, doors thick enough that even ancient Wyams could not break through, and trap systems so sophisticated that dragons attempting forced entry found themselves genuinely endangered. Moreover, dwarves were stubborn to a degree that exceeded even draconic persistence. They would not retreat, would not abandon holds, no matter how many times dragons attacked, would spend generations rebuilding anything Wyrams destroyed. Dealing with dwarves taught dragons a bitter lesson about the limits of power. You could defeat dwarves in every battle, could kill them by the thousands, and they would simply return, rebuild, and continue as if nothing had happened. The rise of mortal civilizations had one positive effect from the draconic perspective. It provided opportunities for worms to position themselves as powers that mortals could not ignore, beings who could grant or withhold favor with consequences mortals cared about. Some dragons became gods to primitive mortal tribes, accepted worship in exchange for protection or magical knowledge. Others established themselves as regional tyrants, demanding tribute from mortal kingdoms in exchange for not destroying them. A few dragons actually integrated into mortal societies, took humanoid forms, and established positions of influence within kingdoms and empires. This latter approach proved surprisingly effective. A dragon disguised as a human court wizard or elf merchant lord could manipulate mortal politics with subtlety impossible through direct force, could achieve goals through influence and deception rather than terrorization. These infiltrator dragons developed their own culture distinct from both metallic and chromatic mainstream traditions, considered themselves sophisticates who understood that true power came from controlling others rather than dominating them through fear. The creator races complicated the material plane's political landscape even further. These were beings who predated current mortal civilizations, ancient peoples who had achieved sophisticated civilization while dragons were still fighting giants and mortals lived in primitive conditions. The Saruk, serpent folk who claimed descent from primordial forces, had built empires that once spanned multiple continents. The Batrachi, frog-like beings with deep understanding of transformation magic, had created cities in swamps and wetlands that even dragons respected. The Aeri, avian people who mastered sky and weather, had established settlements in cloud cities that rivaled anything dragons built. These creator races had largely declined by the time dragons noticed them, their civilizations fragmenting due to internal conflicts, divine punishment, or catastrophic magical experiments. But their ruins remained, filled with artifacts and knowledge that both mortals and dragons sought to claim. Dragons became increasingly interested in these ancient ruins as sources of magical knowledge lost since the First Empire's fragmentation. Creator race magic operated on principles different from draconic traditions, offered insights and techniques that worms could adapt to their own use. Expeditions into these ruins became common among scholarly dragons, particularly metallic worms influenced by the Remembrance. They discovered texts describing cosmological theories dragons had never considered, magical traditions that approached reality manipulation from entirely novel angles, and artifacts whose function and power eclipsed anything in current draconic arsenals. This ancient knowledge helped offset the uncomfortable reality that mortals were developing their own magical traditions that sometimes exceeded draconic capabilities. Dragons could maintain their position as supreme magical beings by claiming creator race knowledge that mortals had not yet discovered. One discovery in particular would have profound consequences for draconic civilization and the entire multiverse. A coalition of ancient gold and silver dragons exploring a ruined Saruk city discovered texts describing the creation of what Saruk called phylacteries, artifacts that could preserve consciousness beyond physical death. The creator race had developed this magic to ensure their most powerful mages could survive the catastrophes that periodically devastated their civilization. The technique required tremendous magical skill, demanded sacrifices that would horrify most civilized beings, and fundamentally altered the practitioner's relationship with life and death. These dragons recognized immediately that such magic could offer worms an answer to their greatest vulnerability. Dragons lived centuries or millennia, but they still died eventually. If they could preserve their consciousness beyond physical death, transfer into new bodies, or persist as disembodied entities, they would achieve something approaching true immortality. The gold and silver dragons who made this discovery debated intensely whether to share it with other worms. They recognized that phylactery magic represented dark power, required murder and the imprisonment of souls, violated principles that metallic dragons supposedly upheld. Moreover, they foresaw that chromatic dragons would use such magic without hesitation or ethical constraint, would transform themselves into undead horrors that retained draconic power while discarding any remaining moral limitations. After extensive consultation with Bahamut himself, the gold and silver dragons decided to destroy the texts and swear never to speak of what they had learned. They believed some knowledge was too dangerous to exist, that preserving draconic mortality was necessary to maintain what little ethical constraint still influenced YRM behavior. This decision proved futile. Other dragons had also been exploring Creator Race ruins, conducting their own research into ancient magic. Within a century, multiple worms had independently discovered phylactery techniques or developed similar magic through their own experimentation. The first Dracolich emerged approximately 2,000 years after the Dragon-Giant Wars ended, an ancient red dragon who refused to accept death and transformed itself into an undead entity that retained all its power and magic while discarding physical vulnerability. This transformation horrified metallic dragons and intrigued chromatics in equal measure. The Dracolich was effectively immortal, could not be permanently destroyed without locating and destroying its phylactery, and possessed all the capabilities of a living ancient worm without mortal weaknesses. Other chromatic dragons, particularly those approaching the end of their natural lifespans, began seeking the knowledge necessary to achieve similar transformation. Bahamut's response to Dracoliches was swift and uncompromising. He declared that any dragon who willingly accepted undeath had forfeited its draconic nature, became an abomination that all true worms were obligated to destroy. The Platinum Dragon empowered his most devoted followers with magic specifically designed to hunt and destroy Dracoliches, provided them with knowledge about phylactery location and destruction, and promised eternal reward for any dragon who fell fighting these undead horrors. Tiamat took the opposite position, welcomed Dracoliches as proof that chromatic dragons could transcend even death through power and will. She provided protection to Dracoliches who swore loyalty to her, incorporated them into her schemes, and used them as champions who could operate in situations where risking permanent death would deter living worms. The Dracolich controversy deepened the divide between metallic and chromatic dragons, transformed philosophical disagreement into open hostility that occasionally erupted into violence. The appearance of Dracoliches fundamentally changed how mortals perceived dragons. Previously, even the most primitive humans or elves had recognized that dragons were dangerous but natural beings, creatures that could be reasoned with, avoided, or potentially even befriended under the right circumstances. Dracoliches were something else entirely, abominations that violated natural order, horrors that pursued power without restraint or mercy. Mortal heroes began specifically seeking out dragons to prevent them from becoming undead, reasoning that killing a living dragon was morally defensible if it prevented Dracolich transformation. This created conflicts between metallic dragons and mortal dragon hunters, as worms who had no intention of pursuing undeath found themselves attacked by adventurers who assumed all dragons represented threats that needed elimination. Some metallic dragons attempted to establish diplomatic relationships with mortal kingdoms, offered their services as advisors or champions in exchange for protection from dragon hunting extremists. These arrangements occasionally succeeded but more often failed as mortal paranoia about draconic intentions overrode rational assessment of actual threats. During this period, a third distinct category of dragons emerged. These were the gem dragons, Wyams who claimed spiritual descent from Sardior, the ruby dragon. Gem dragons had always existed alongside metallics and chromatics, but they had remained largely separate from the conflicts that defined relationships between Bahamut's and Tiamat's followers. Gem dragons pursued goals that seemed incomprehensible to other Wyams, focused on philosophical enlightenment, psionic development, and understanding of planar cosmology, rather than simple power accumulation or moral posturing. They established territories on the outer planes rather than material plane, claimed domains in limbo, where their understanding of thought given form let them shape reality through pure will. Amethyst, crystal, emerald, sapphire, and topaz dragons each developed distinct philosophical traditions, different approaches to understanding existence, separate methods for achieving the transcendence, gem dragons believed represented ultimate draconic destiny. Sardior himself remained an enigmatic figure whose relationship to Io, Bahamut, and Tiamat was never clearly established. Some legends claimed he was Io's first creation, born before the ninefold dragon conceived Bahamut and Tiamat, sent to explore the outer planes while his siblings focused on material existence. Others insisted Sardior was simply the first gem dragon, a being who achieved such enlightenment that he ascended to become a divine figure without ever actually being Io's offspring or possessing inherent divinity. A third interpretation suggested Sardior represented yet another fragment of Io's essence, the aspect of the concordant dragon concerned with thought, knowledge, and the manipulation of reality through consciousness rather than force. Regardless of his true origins, Sardior commanded absolute loyalty from gem dragons, who considered him the pinnacle of what dragons could become through deliberate philosophical evolution rather than simple accumulation of power or adherence to moral principles. Gem dragons largely avoided the material plane conflicts that consumed metallic and chromatic attention. They considered such struggles petty distractions from truly important pursuits, believed that fighting over physical territory missed the point that reality itself was mutable to beings who understood its fundamental nature. This perspective infuriated both Bahamut's and Tiamat's followers in different ways. Metallic dragons considered gem dragon neutrality, cowardice, failure to support justice against tyranny. Chromatic dragons saw it as insufferable smugness, rejection of strength-based hierarchy by weaklings who lacked courage to compete. Gem dragons ignored both criticisms, considered themselves to have transcended the false dichotomy between good and evil that limited less enlightened Wyams. They pursued understanding of concepts like reality manipulation through controlled madness, the nature of thought given permanent physical form, and the possibility of achieving existence beyond standard cosmological categories like material, divine, or elemental. The gem dragon's focus on psionic power represented yet another evolution in draconic capabilities. Traditional draconic magic involved manipulating external forces, bending reality through will reinforced by connection to fundamental cosmic energies. Psionics approached power from the opposite direction, manipulating reality through internal force, reshaping existence through disciplined consciousness rather than external energy channeling. Gem dragons developed abilities that seemed impossible by conventional magical standards. They could alter their own physical form through pure thought, temporarily exist in multiple locations simultaneously, perceive events occurring on distant planes, and influence other beings' minds with sophistication that exceeded anything enchantment magic could achieve. These capabilities made gem dragons extremely dangerous despite their philosophical detachment from material plane conflicts. A dragon who could read thoughts, manipulate memories, or project mental attacks across planar boundaries required different defensive strategies than YRMs who relied on physical power and conventional magic. The elves discovered this truth during what became known as the Crown Wars, a series of conflicts that devastated elven civilization and demonstrated that mortal magical sophistication now rivaled anything dragons could achieve. Multiple elven kingdoms went to war using magic that approached or exceeded what dragons had deployed during the Dragon Giant Wars. They summoned demons and devils as shock troops, created permanent portals to the elemental planes that flooded regions with destructive energies, and developed spells specifically designed to kill other elves en masse. An amethyst dragon named Othakant witnessed these conflicts from philosophical distance, studying how elven desperation drove magical innovation. When certain elven mages began developing rituals that would have sundered planar boundaries and potentially unmade the material plane, Othakant concluded that mortal evolution had reached dangerous velocity that even gem dragons could not ignore. The amethyst Wyrm intervened directly, confronted the elven archmages, and demonstrated psionic capabilities that exceeded anything their conventional magic could counter. Othakant restructured their memories, removed knowledge of the reality-breaking rituals, and implanted false memories that those rituals had failed during testing. This intervention represented gem dragon pragmatism at its finest. They refused to involve themselves in material conflicts over resources or territory, but they would act decisively when fundamental cosmological stability faced threat. The Crown Wars ended with elven civilization permanently damaged, their greatest kingdoms destroyed or diminished, their populations scattered across the material plane. Dragons observed these conflicts with mixed reactions. Chromatic worms considered it proof that mortals inevitably destroyed themselves given sufficient time and power. Validation that draconic supremacy remained inevitable regardless of temporary mortal achievements. Metallic dragons saw it as tragedy that might have been prevented if they had engaged more actively with mortal civilizations, established relationships that would have let them guide elven development away from destructive paths. Gem dragons treated it as data supporting their theoretical frameworks about consciousness, power, and the recursive relationship between reality manipulation and civilizational stability. A human wizard named Karsus provided the next great demonstration of mortal capabilities and limitations simultaneously. This individual achieved magical sophistication that exceeded any contemporary dragon's abilities, developed an understanding of the weave's fundamental nature that rivaled what ancient worms had learned across millennia. Karsus became obsessed with surpassing divine power, believed that through sufficient magical mastery, a mortal could achieve capabilities exceeding even gods. He developed a spell of unprecedented complexity and ambition, magic designed to steal a deity's portfolio and power, to transform a mortal wizard into an actual god through sheer force of magical will. The spell worked, briefly. Karsus successfully stole the power of Mistral, goddess of magic itself, gained control over the entire weave for a handful of seconds, then everything collapsed. Mistral's death caused the weave to fail catastrophically. Magic stopped functioning across the entire material plane, and Karsus himself perished as the divine power he had stolen proved impossible for mortal consciousness to contain. Dragons who witnessed Karsus's folly drew multiple lessons from this catastrophe. First, mortal magical achievement now genuinely rivaled or exceeded draconic capabilities in specific areas. No dragon could have conceived or executed a spell as sophisticated as Karsus's avatar, let alone successfully implemented it even temporarily. This forced Wyams to accept that mortals had developed magical traditions completely independent of draconic knowledge, traditions that approached problems from angles dragons had never considered. Second, the weave's temporary failure demonstrated something dragons had never fully appreciated. They had always treated magic as fundamental aspect of reality itself, something as reliable and permanent as gravity or time. Karsus proved that magic was actually a contingent system maintained by divine power, something that could fail if the appropriate deity died or lost control. Dragons began studying the weave's nature with new urgency, attempted to understand its structure and vulnerabilities, developed backup capabilities in case it failed again. The goddess Mistral resurrected herself as Mistra, a reformed deity who implemented new restrictions on mortal magic. She banned specific categories of spells deemed too dangerous, created limits on how much power individual mortals could channel, and established monitoring systems that would alert her to any attempts to recreate Karsus's achievement. Dragons largely welcomed these restrictions, which conveniently prevented mortals from achieving magical capabilities that genuinely threatened Wyrem supremacy. Some worms, particularly ancient chromatics, saw opportunity in Mistra's limitations. The goddess had constrained mortal magic specifically, creating rules that applied to mortal spellcasters. Dragons were not mortals, not in any sense Mistra's restrictions recognized. This meant worms could potentially study forbidden magic without triggering divine attention, could research techniques Mistra had banned specifically because she considered them too dangerous for mortals to wield. Several ancient red and blue dragons began secret projects exploring this frontier, attempted to develop magic that combined draconic innate power with forbidden techniques mortals could no longer study. These experiments bore fruit in unexpected ways. Dragons discovered that combining draconic innate abilities with forbidden mortal magic created hybrid techniques exceeding either tradition's individual capabilities. A dragon using conventional breath weapon was terrifying but fundamentally limited by their physical nature. A dragon who had learned to merge breath weapon mechanics with band transformation magic could create effects that defied normal physical constraints, could manifest breath attacks that warped space, stopped time, or violated causality in ways that made defense impossible. Mystra eventually noticed these experiments and confronted the worms involved. The confrontations generally ended with compromise rather than conflict. Mystra recognized she could not actually ban dragons from learning magic without provoking war with beings who predated her current incarnation and possessed power that could genuinely threaten even divine entities. Dragons agreed to certain voluntary restrictions, primarily commitments not to share forbidden techniques with mortals or use them in ways that would destabilize the weave. Both sides left these arrangements somewhat dissatisfied but unwilling to escalate further. The material plane's political landscape continued evolving as mortal civilizations established increasingly sophisticated kingdoms and empires. Human kingdoms like Netheril developed magical traditions that rivaled anything elves had achieved, created flying cities sustained entirely through arcane power, and pushed the boundaries of what magic could accomplish. Dragons watched these developments with concern and fascination in equal measure. Netheril represented exactly the kind of mortal achievement that should have been impossible. Civilization sustained through magical mastery that exceeded what most dragons could achieve. Some Wyrms proposed destroying Netheril before it could advance further, argued that allowing mortals to continue developing such capabilities would eventually render dragons obsolete. Others, primarily metallic dragons, advocated engagement and cooperation, suggested that dragons could benefit from alliance with Netherese archmages. A few dragons actually joined Netheril, took positions as advisors or research partners, contributed their own knowledge to Netheril's magical development in exchange for access to mortal innovations. Netheril's eventual fate provided another lesson in the dangers of unconstrained magical ambition. Netherese archmages attempted to ascend to godhood en masse, developed ritual magic that would have transformed their entire civilization into a nation of deities. This prospect terrified the existing pantheon, who recognized that hundreds of new gods appearing simultaneously would destabilize divine hierarchies and potentially trigger another cosmic conflict rivaling the Dawn War. The gods collectively intervened, destroyed Netheril's floating cities, and ended the empire in single catastrophic day. The devastation exceeded anything dragons had inflicted during the Dragon-Giant Wars, demonstrated that divine power remained fundamentally superior to even the most sophisticated mortal magic. Dragons took note of the underlying message. The gods would tolerate mortal achievement only to certain limits, would destroy entire civilizations rather than allow mortals to genuinely threaten divine supremacy. This realization created interesting strategic calculations for dragons seeking to maintain their own position. If gods would destroy mortal civilizations that became too powerful, then dragons benefited from mortal advancement up to but not beyond those critical thresholds. Sufficiently powerful mortal kingdoms diverted divine attention, forced gods to focus on managing mortal affairs rather than constraining draconic activities. But if mortals achieved capabilities that provoked divine intervention, the resulting cataclysms would devastate regions dragons cared about, destroy resources worms coveted, and generally create chaos that even dragons would find disadvantageous. This led some worms, particularly ancient and cunning, chromatic dragons, to begin actively manipulating mortal civilizations. They would support mortal magical development enough to keep mortals interesting and distracting to gods, but would sabotage or destroy any mortal achievements that approached levels likely to trigger divine retaliation. The cult of the dragon emerged during this period as a mortal organization that combined reverence for draconic power with destructive nihilism. Founded by a mad archmage convinced that undead dragons represented perfect beings transcending mortal and draconic limitations, the cult dedicated itself to helping dragons achieve dracolich transformation. Cult members would locate dying worms, offer them phylactery creation services, provide victims for the murders necessary to complete undeath transformation, and serve the resulting dracoliches as fanatical followers. The cult complicated relationships between dragons and mortals significantly. They demonstrated that some mortals worshipped dragons as beings worthy of reverence approaching divinity, validated draconic self-perception as supreme entities. But they also represented everything wrong with mortal ambition and madness, proved that mortal intelligence combined with draconic obsession created horrors exceeding either group's individual capacity for destruction. Both metallic and chromatic dragons denounced the cult publicly while dealing with it very differently in practice. Metallic dragons hunted cult members actively, saw them as threats requiring elimination. Chromatic dragons often used the cult when convenient while maintaining public distance, recognized that fanatical mortal servants had their uses, even if associating with them too openly would invite metallic dragon attention. On certain worlds, dragons became integrated into mortal civilization in ways that transformed both species. On Krynn, a world where gods took particularly active interest in mortal affairs, dragons became divided into forces serving good and evil deities directly. Metallic dragons served Paladine and the gods of light, became champions in eternal struggle against chromatic dragons, who served Takesis and evil deities. This arrangement suited Bahamut's philosophy perfectly, transformed dragons from neutral superior beings into active participants in cosmic moral struggle. Chromatic dragons on Krynn chafed under divine control but recognized that Takesis provided resources and support they could not achieve alone. The world experienced cycles of draconic warfare that shaped mortal history, periods when chromatic dragons conquered vast territories before metallic dragons and mortal heroes drove them back. These conflicts demonstrated that dragons fully integrated into divine moral frameworks behaved fundamentally differently from worms, maintaining traditional independence, suggested that draconic nature itself remained more mutable than most worms wanted to admit. On Eberron, dragons developed entirely separate trajectory, unconnected to Bahamut, Tiamat, or Io. These Wyrms claimed descent from different cosmic forces, studied magic through lens called the Draconic Prophecy, believed that reality itself was vast text that could be read and potentially edited by beings with sufficient understanding. Eberron dragons became scholars and philosophers rather than conquerors or tyrants, dedicated themselves to understanding prophecy and manipulating events to achieve outcomes they believed would benefit cosmic balance. They established a continent called Argonasen, where dragons maintained civilization completely separate from mortal affairs, policed by ancient Wyrms, who destroyed any dragon showing interest in inappropriate levels of engagement with mortal societies. These Eberron worms demonstrated yet again that draconic nature could express itself in radically different ways depending on cosmological context and cultural evolution. They were recognizably dragons, possessed the power and intelligence that defined their species, but directed those attributes toward goals that would seem alien to Wyrms from worlds where Bahamut and Tiamat held influence. The appearance of these alternate dragon cultures created fascinating philosophical debates among worms on worlds where Io's lineage held sway. Some dragons insisted that Eberron and Krynn worms were not truly dragons at all, argued they had diverged so fundamentally from core draconic nature that they should be considered separate species. Others suggested these variations proved that draconic nature was more expansive than any single interpretation, that different cosmological contexts would naturally produce different expressions of fundamental Yrm characteristics. Gem dragons found the entire debate amusing, considered it proof that metallics and chromatics remained trapped in limited thinking that prioritized specific philosophical positions over genuine understanding of draconic multiplicity. Sardior himself allegedly remarked that dragons arguing about what constituted true draconic nature were like fish debating the nature of water, discussing something they were too immersed in to truly perceive objectively. The time of troubles brought divine politics directly into mortal affairs in unprecedented ways. On the world of Toril, home to the Forgotten Realms, the gods were cast down to walk among mortals, forced to inhabit avatar forms while cosmic restructuring occurred. This created situations where dragons encountered deities in relatively vulnerable states, had opportunities to observe divine behavior without the power differential that normally made such observations impossible. Ancient worms who witnessed gods struggling with mortal-level problems reconsidered assumptions about divine nature and superiority. The gods, stripped of their cosmic power, behaved remarkably like mortals or dragons in comparable situations. They plotted, schemed, formed alliances, betrayed partners, and generally demonstrated that divine nature was perhaps less fundamentally different from mortal or draconic nature than anyone had assumed. This realization shifted how some dragons thought about their relationship to gods. Perhaps deities were not qualitatively superior beings but merely entities who had achieved greater power through different means. Perhaps dragons who achieved sufficient understanding could claim divine portfolios not through theft, as Casus attempted, but through legitimate ascension. Several dragons attempted exactly such ascension during the millennium following the time of troubles. Most failed, their mortal forms and consciousness unable to contain divine power even when they successfully claimed portfolios. A handful succeeded, achieved genuine godhood that transformed them from powerful mortals into legitimate deities with worshippers and divine realms. These ascended dragons generally maintained low profiles, recognized that openly joining divine pantheons would provoke responses from established gods who disliked competitors. They established small cults among mortals and dragons, claimed minor portfolios that major gods considered beneath notice, and slowly built divine power through careful management rather than dramatic conquest. Their existence proved that the gap between powerful dragon and minor deity was not unbridgeable, that whims who pursued divinity through appropriate means could achieve it. This possibility obsessed certain ancient dragons, particularly those approaching the end of their natural lifespans who saw divine ascension as alternative to Dracolich transformation. The spell plague represented catastrophe on scales that exceeded anything dragons had experienced since the Dragon-Giant Wars. Mystra's murder caused the weave to collapse completely, not the temporary failure Casus had triggered, but fundamental structural damage that took decades to repair even partially. Magic stopped functioning reliably across the entire material plane. Spells that had worked for millennia suddenly failed or produced random effects. Magical items became inert or dangerously unstable. Regions where magic had been particularly concentrated transformed into plaguelands, where reality itself functioned incorrectly, where physical laws became optional, where simply existing required constant adaptation to changing conditions. Dragons found themselves suddenly vulnerable in ways they had never experienced. Their innate magical abilities faltered, breath weapons became unpredictable, flight sometimes failed without warning. Ancient Wyrms who had relied on permanent magical effects for defense or utility discovered those effects had vanished, leaving them exposed to threats they had not worried about for centuries. The immediate aftermath saw many dragons die from causes that should not have threatened them. Mortal adventurers seized the opportunity to assault lairs, while worms were weakened, managed to kill dragons they could never have challenged under normal circumstances. Dragons who had been pursuing magical research when the spell plague struck often perished in catastrophic explosions as their experiments went wrong. Worms, who had made enemies among gods, found themselves targeted by divine servants while temporarily unable to mount full defensive responses. The death toll reached levels not seen since the Dragon-Giant Wars, shocked draconic civilization, and forced worms to reconsider fundamental assumptions about their power and security. If magic itself could fail, if the abilities that made dragons supreme could vanish without warning, then what exactly guaranteed their continued dominance over mortals and other beings? This existential crisis drove different responses from different dragon factions. Metallic dragons redoubled their emphasis on non-magical capabilities, developed combat techniques that relied primarily on physical power rather than spells or breath weapons. Chromatic dragons became more aggressive and paranoid, struck preemptively at perceived threats rather than risk being caught vulnerable again. Gem dragons intensified their study of psionic power, which had largely continued functioning during the spell plague since it operated through different mechanisms than conventional magic. The weave's eventual restoration under new goddess Mistra brought relief but also revealed permanent changes in how magic functioned. The new weave operated on subtly different principles than its predecessor, required different approaches to spellcasting, and incorporated restrictions that made certain previously possible magic impossible regardless of caster skill. Dragons adapted to these changes faster than most mortals, their innate connection to magical forces letting them intuitively grasp the new weave's structure. This provided temporary advantage as worms exploited new magical possibilities while mortal spellcasters struggled to relearn fundamentals. But the advantage proved short-lived as mortal magical organizations rebuilt their knowledge bases and adapted their teaching methods. Within a century, mortal magic had returned to pre-spell plague sophistication, demonstrated again that mortals' shorter generational cycles and collective knowledge accumulation let them adapt to changes faster than longer-lived species who relied more heavily on individual experience. The Sundering brought yet another cosmic restructuring, this time focused on reversing changes the spell plague had caused to planar geography and metaphysics. Multiple worlds that had been merged during the spell plague separated again, planar boundaries that had become dangerously permeable were reinforced, and the multiverse generally returned to something approximating its pre-spell plague configuration. Dragons experienced this transformation as disorienting reality shifts that sometimes moved them between worlds without warning, relocated their hordes to different planes, or altered their territories in tectonation, fundamental ways. Worms who had established lairs in regions that existed only because of spell plague reality warping found themselves suddenly in completely different locations when the Sundering reversed those changes. The disruption proved less catastrophic than the spell plague itself, but still forced significant adaptations across draconic civilization. Dragons who had spent decades establishing position and gathering resources discovered that cosmic forces beyond even their control could render such efforts meaningless through casual reality restructuring. These repeated cosmic catastrophes taught dragons uncomfortable lessons about the limits of individual power. No matter how ancient, how powerful, how magically sophisticated a dragon became, beings and forces existed that could reshape reality in ways that made individual capabilities irrelevant. Gods could destroy civilizations with casual effort, cosmic events could eliminate magic entirely. Planar restructuring could relocate continents or merge entire worlds. In this context, what did draconic supremacy actually mean? This question generated extensive philosophical debate among all dragon factions. Chromatic dragons generally concluded that cosmic vulnerability made gathering immediate power and resources even more crucial, since catastrophe could eliminate everything at any moment. Metallic dragons saw it as validation of their emphasis on relationships and alliances, argued that dragons working with others could achieve stability that individual power could not. Gem dragons treated it as supporting their focus on consciousness and understanding, suggested that beings who truly comprehended reality's nature could maintain themselves through transformations that would destroy those depending purely on physical power. In the modern era, dragons found themselves operating in multiverse fundamentally different from the one where their civilization had first emerged. Mortal societies now equaled or exceeded anything the first Dragon Empire had achieved, commanded magic that rivaled draconic capabilities, and possessed demographic advantages that made them impossible to dominate through force alone. Gods took active interest in material plane affairs, established rules and boundaries that limited what even ancient Wyams could accomplish without divine interference. The planes themselves had been restructured multiple times, creating cosmological architecture that reflected divine preferences rather than neutral cosmic forces. In this transformed reality, dragons occupied a unique but no longer supreme position. They remained among the most individually powerful beings that regularly interacted with mortal civilizations, but they no longer dominated through unquestionable superiority. Instead, dragons had become one powerful force among several. participants in complicated political and military landscapes where success required alliances, subtlety, and careful calculation rather than simple assertion of strength. Different dragons adapted to this reality in characteristically different ways. Many ancient Wyams simply withdrew from engagement entirely, established lairs in remote locations where they could maintain traditional draconic existence without dealing with the complexities of modern multiverse. These reclusive dragons pursued personal goals like hoard accumulation, magical research, or simply existing in peace without interference. They represented what most mortals imagined when thinking about dragons, solitary tyrants occupying mountain lairs and jealously guarding treasure. But this traditional image captured only one subset of modern draconic civilization. Other worms engaged actively with mortal societies, established themselves as power players in kingdoms and empires, pursued goals that required cooperation with or manipulation of other beings. These politically active dragons ranged from metallic Wyams serving as advisors and protectors to chromatic dragons who ruled territories through proxies or used their abilities to manipulate mortal politics from behind scenes. A smaller subset of dragons dedicated themselves to pursuing the great questions that had always fascinated their race. These scholarly Wyrms studied planar mechanics, investigated the true nature of divinity and how dragons might achieve it, researched cosmological mysteries like the relationship between different draconic lineages across multiple worlds. They established networks that transcended the usual metallic chromatic divide, collaborated with gem dragons who possessed expertise in relevant areas, and sometimes even worked with mortal scholars whose shorter lifespans and different perspectives provided insights dragons alone could not achieve. These research-focused Wyams represented what many considered the truest continuation of First Empire traditions, dragons who pursued knowledge and understanding as goals worth achieving regardless of immediate practical applications. The relationship between dragons and mortals had evolved into something far more complex than simple predator-prey dynamics or tyrant-subject hierarchies. In many regions, dragons had become integrated into mortal societies in ways that would have seemed impossible during earlier eras. Metallic dragons commonly served as advisors to kings, defenders of important locations, or teachers of arcane knowledge. Chromatic dragons occupied similar niches where their particular skills proved valuable despite their generally destructive tendencies. A red dragon's understanding of warfare and intimidation made them excellent military advisors, assuming one could control their tendency toward excessive violence. A blue dragon's mastery of lightning magic and desert survival made them invaluable in certain regions, provided they could be prevented from establishing themselves as tyrannical overlords. Even relatively small communities sometimes maintained relationships with specific dragons, paid tribute, or provided services in exchange for protection from other threats. These accommodations existed in tension with dragons who maintained traditional adversarial relationships with mortals. Dragon hunters remained common across many worlds. Adventurers who specialized in locating and killing worms for bounties, treasure, or ideological commitment to eliminating draconic threats. These hunters had evolved sophisticated capabilities that made them genuinely dangerous even to ancient dragons. They studied draconic behavior and biology obsessively, developed weapons and tactics specifically designed to exploit Wyrm vulnerabilities, and often included spellcasters who could counter draconic magic. The existence of effective dragon hunters created interesting strategic calculations for Wyrms. Maintaining too high a profile or engaging in behavior that attracted hunter attention could prove fatal regardless of individual power. This incentivized more cautious and subtle approaches even among chromatic dragons who philosophically believed in bold assertion of dominance. Cult activity remained a persistent problem that complicated draconic existence. The original cult of the dragon had fragmented into multiple successor organizations with varying goals and methodologies, but all remained dedicated to serving dragons they considered worthy of worship or assistance. Some cults focused on helping Wyrms achieve lichdom as the original organization had done. Others served living chromatic dragons, provided resources and services in exchange for magical knowledge or simply proximity to draconic power. A few cults claimed to serve Tiamat directly, sought to engineer circumstances that would permit her return to material plane in physical form. These cults represented useful tools for dragons willing to manipulate mortal worship, but they also created problems by attracting attention from those opposed to draconic influence. Metallic dragons generally despised the cults and worked to eliminate them, saw them as corrupting mortal-dragon relationships and enabling chromatic tyranny. Chromatic dragons maintained more ambivalent attitudes, appreciated cultist resources, but resented implications that they needed mortal assistance to achieve their goals. The modern era also saw new categories of draconic beings emerge through magical experimentation and intentional creation. Half-dragons, beings who combined draconic and mortal characteristics through magical or biological means, had existed in limited numbers throughout history. In recent centuries, they became more common as magical sophistication made their creation more reliable, and some dragons deliberately produced half-dragon offspring to serve as agents in mortal society. These hybrid beings possessed fraction of true draconic power, but could operate in contexts where full dragons would attract unwanted attention. Their status remained controversial across draconic civilization. Many pure-blooded dragons considered half-dragons to be abominations or tools rather than actual kin, resented any suggestion that they deserved recognition as legitimate draconic beings. Other worms, particularly metallic dragons influenced by Bahamut's relatively inclusive philosophy, argued that half-dragons who demonstrated draconic qualities of power and intelligence deserved respect regardless of their mixed heritage. Dragonborn represented even more controversial category. These humanoid beings possessed draconic characteristics like scales, breath weapons, and dragonic heritage, but their exact relationship to true dragons remained contested. Some Dragonborn claimed descent from ancient dragons who had taken humanoid form and produced offspring. Others insisted they were entirely separate creation, a race that happened to share certain characteristics with dragons without actually being related to them. Dragons held wildly varying opinions about Dragonborn legitimacy. Some ancient worms treated Dragonborn as embarrassing reminders of ancestors who had degraded themselves through involvement with mortals. Other dragons welcomed Dragonborn as potential allies, beings who carried fragments of draconic power and might advance warm interests in mortal societies. Dragonborn themselves often felt conflicted about relationship to true dragons, sought recognition and approval from beings who represented everything their culture revered, while simultaneously resenting implications that they were inferior copies rather than legitimate entities in their own right. The increasing diversity of draconic and draconic-related beings raised profound questions about what exactly defined a dragon in the modern age. Was it purely biological heritage, direct descent from Io or one of his aspects? Was it demonstration of particular capabilities like flight, breath weapons, and magical aptitude? Was it psychological nature, the characteristic pride, territoriality, and certainty of superiority that defined traditional draconic personality? These questions became especially pointed as magic, capable of granting temporary or permanent draconic characteristics, became more widespread. Polymorphed dragons operating in humanoid form retained their essential nature despite appearing as mortals. But what about mortals who used magic to gain draconic abilities? If a human wizard developed permanent flight, resistance to magic, and breath weapon capabilities that matched or exceeded young dragon abilities, did they become dragons or remain mortals who happened to possess draconic powers? Most dragons rejected any suggestion that mere acquisition of abilities granted draconic status, insisted that true draconic nature involved essence beyond any list of capabilities. But they struggled to articulate exactly what that essence involved, beyond circular reasoning that dragons were dragon because they were born dragon. The ancient question of Io's fate and the ninefold dragon's relationship to modern draconic civilization remained unanswered, despite millennia of scholarship and speculation. Some legends claimed Io had died, slain by the primordial Erek Hus during the Dawn War, and that Bahamut and Tiamat emerged from the concordant dragon's sundered corpse. This narrative possessed dramatic appeal and explained why Bahamut and Tiamat embodied opposite extremes rather than unified balance, but it created uncomfortable implications about whether anyone who actually remembered Io's death remained alive to confirm the story. Other traditions insisted Io still existed somewhere in the multiverse, either sleeping until draconic civilization required intervention or operating on such cosmic scale that mortal and divine affairs seemed beneath notice. A third interpretation suggested Io had deliberately dispersed itself into all dragons, that the concordant dragon's essence existed distributed across every YRMAM and would only reunify if dragonkind ever achieved true unity. This last theory possessed philosophical elegance, but left practical questions unanswered about what unified dragonkind would mean, and whether such unity was even possible given fundamental conflicts between metallic, chromatic, and gem dragon philosophies. Bahamut and Tiamat themselves represented constant presence in draconic civilization, though their influence manifested differently across dragon communities. Bahamut maintained active involvement with metallic dragons who sought his guidance, provided counsel through dreams and visions, occasionally manifested avatars to assist worms facing challenges beyond their individual power. The Platinum Dragon cultivated personal relationships with many metallic dragons, knew them as individuals rather than abstract followers. This hands-on approach created strong loyalty among Bahamut's followers, but also generated criticism from dragons who believed such intimate divine involvement compromised draconic independence. Tiamat took different approach, maintained distance from most chromatic dragons while cultivating networks of favored servants who acted with her authority. She preferred indirect influence through manipulation and arrangement rather than direct commands, believed this approach better respected chromatic dragons' essential nature as independent beings who resented explicit hierarchy. Tiamat's distant approach meant many chromatic dragons maintained only abstract loyalty to her, recognized her supremacy without involving her in their daily decisions or long-term plans. The contrast between Bahamut's and Tiamat's methodologies reflected broader differences in how metallic and chromatic dragons organized themselves. Metallic dragon communities maintained extensive communication networks, shared information about threats and opportunities, coordinated responses to challenges that affected multiple YAMs. They held councils where ancient gold and silver dragons discussed matters affecting their collective interests. Established informal hierarchies based on age and wisdom rather than pure power. Chromatic dragons rejected such organization, maintained traditional individualism that made cooperation difficult even when it would serve their interests. A chromatic dragon might ally temporarily with others to accomplish specific goals, but such alliances rarely survived beyond immediate need. This difference in organizational sophistication provided metallic dragons significant advantages in conflicts where coordination mattered, let them leverage collective strength in ways individual chromatic dragons could not match. But it also created vulnerabilities, made metallic communities susceptible to infiltration and manipulation by cunning chromatic YAMs who exploited metallic's trusting nature. Gem dragons continued occupying their unique position largely separate from metallic chromatic conflicts. They established enclaves on the outer planes where they pursued scholarly and philosophical goals, without interference from material concerns. Occasionally, gem dragons would involve themselves in material plane events when they detected developments relevant to their interests. But such interventions remained rare and usually subtle. Most mortals and even many metallic and chromatic dragons remained unaware of gem dragons' existence, treated them as legends or exotic variants rather than distinct civilization with its own goals and culture. This suited gem dragons perfectly, as they had no interest in the attention their cousins attracted through constant conflict and territory disputes. Sardior's status remained as mysterious as ever, with gem dragons claiming he existed in state, transcending normal divine or mortal categories, but offering little evidence that could convince outsiders of such claims' validity. In the current age, Dragons remained fundamental to how inhabitants of the multiverse understood power, ambition, and the relationship between individual capability and cosmic significance. They appeared in mortal legends and religious traditions as symbols of ultimate challenge, beings heroes must overcome to prove their worth, or treasures adventurers must claim to achieve prosperity. They served as measuring sticks by which mortals evaluated their own accomplishments, markers that defined the difference between ordinary achievement and truly legendary status. The simple fact that a kingdom or hero had dealt with dragon attack became credentials establishing capability and importance. Dragons influenced mortal culture through simple existence, shaped how people thought about power and ambition without requiring any direct action beyond being what they were. Dragons also continued pushing boundaries of what individuals could achieve through power and knowledge. Ancient Wyams who had survived from the First Empire's era possessed understanding of magic and cosmology that exceeded what most mortals or gods could claim. They remembered ages before current divine pantheons established themselves, had witnessed cosmic restructurings that transformed fundamental reality, and retained knowledge of magic that predated modern Weave's structure. These ancient dragons served as living repositories of lore that could not be recovered through any other means, made them simultaneously valuable resources and dangerous concentrations of power that various factions sought to control or eliminate. The few ancient Wyams who chose to engage with mortal or divine civilization found themselves courted by organizations that valued their knowledge, while those who maintained isolation became targets for those who believed dangerous knowledge should be destroyed rather than preserved. The greatest dragons of the modern era had achieved status approaching mythic even by draconic standards. Worms like Clouth the Old Snarl, an ancient red dragon whose age exceeded most gods' existence, or Protanther, an ancient gold dragon whose magical knowledge rivaled anything mortal archmages had achieved. These legendary individuals demonstrated what dragons could accomplish through centuries of focused development, showed that properly channeled draconic potential could achieve things that exceeded normal limitations of their species. They also illustrated persistent problems with draconic nature. Many legendary worms had become increasingly detached from normal civilization, pursued goals comprehensible only to themselves, and represented dangers to everyone around them through simple indifference to others' welfare. The same qualities that made them legendary, their absolute focus and unwillingness to accept limitations, made them terrible neighbors and unreliable allies. The future of draconic civilization remained uncertain in ways that would have seemed impossible during the First Empire's height. Dragons no longer held unquestioned supremacy, no longer represented the obvious inheritors of cosmic dominion, but they also had not declined into irrelevance, had not become merely another powerful species among many. Instead, they occupied paradoxical position as beings whose individual power remained unmatched, while their collective influence had diminished from ancient peaks. Some dragons believed this represented permanent new reality, that their race would never again achieve civilizational dominance, but could thrive as powerful individuals operating within more complex political landscape. Others insisted that current state represented temporary setback, that dragons needed only proper leadership or catastrophe that eliminated rival powers to restore traditional supremacy. A third faction argued for fundamental transformation, suggested dragons should embrace integration into mortal civilizations rather than maintaining separation that left them increasingly isolated from multiverse's evolving political realities. Regardless of which vision ultimately prevailed, certain truths about dragons remained constant across all ages and circumstances. They were beings of immense power whose capabilities exceeded what most creatures could achieve through any amount of effort. They possessed intelligence and lifespans that let them develop sophistication few others could match. They embodied pride and certainty of their own significance that seemed unshakable regardless of external circumstances. These core characteristics had persisted from Io's first emergence in the primordial chaos through every cosmic catastrophe and civilizational transformation that followed. They would likely continue defining draconic nature regardless of whatever challenges the future brought. would make dragons recognizably themselves, even as everything around them changed in ways that made previous ages unrecognizable. The simple fact of their existence shaped how others understood power and ambition, made them unavoidable reference points in any discussion of significance or capability. This influence would persist as long as dragons existed, would ensure their importance, regardless of whether they ever reclaimed civilizational dominance they once held. The story of dragons was ultimately a story about power itself, about what beings did when they possessed capabilities that let them reshape reality according to their will. Different dragons provided different answers to questions inherent in such power. Metallic dragons insisted power carried responsibility, that capability obligated its wielders to protect and guide rather than dominate and destroy. Chromatic dragons argued power existed to be exercised, that strength created its own justification and needed no moral framework beyond winner-takes-all competition. Gem dragons suggested power was ultimately subordinate to understanding, that manipulating reality meant nothing without comprehending what reality actually was and why particular manipulations were preferable to alternatives. None of these perspectives fully captured draconic nature's complexity, but together they defined the range within which dragons operated and the choices they made as they navigated multiverse that had become far more complicated than the simple age of supremacy they remembered or imagined. Dragons would continue existing as long as the multiverse itself persisted, would continue challenging heroes and threatening civilizations, would continue pursuing their hordes and ambitions with characteristic determination. They would adapt as they had always adapted, surviving cosmic catastrophes that destroyed lesser beings, evolving to meet challenges that would have ended races lacking their resilience. The specific forms those adaptations would take remained unpredictable, but the fundamental nature of dragons suggested certain constants would persist. There would always be worms who pursued power for its own sake, who gathered treasure and defended territories with violence that shocked more civilized beings. There would always be dragons who attempted to transcend their nature, who sought enlightenment or divine ascension or simple peace rather than endless competition. And there would always be tension between these approaches, conflict that generated the dynamism keeping draconic civilization alive even as it prevented unity that might restore their ancient dominance. This was the essential nature of dragonkind, what made them simultaneously magnificent and terrible, beings capable of inspiring awe and fear in equal measure across all ages and all worlds, where they spread their wings and claimed the sky as their birthright.